Alright, so lecture 5 is about landforms in the state of California. So we'll look at how those landforms interact with each other first, and then we'll move on to a little bit of an overview of each of them, some of the interesting or unique features about each of them. So first we want to talk about the ways that the Earth's crust interacts within itself, the different plates of the Earth's crust, and how they affect California's topography. So we have divergent zones occurring where the two plates are sort of moving away from each other, the surface crust anyway. And so there are areas like California where you have a divergent zone out in the ocean where one plate is moving towards the land, the other one is moving away, and so it creates basically a trench type of landform. And so that's happening out there in the ocean, creating those trenches that are below water level. Maybe more significantly, as far as what we can actually see, are subduction zones. So in this case, we have landforms moving towards each other. In the case of California, the oceanic crust moving towards the continental crust, and where the lithosphere is being forced down below the lithosphere of another one of the plates, you get upheaval. So basically the Sierra Nevada mountains were created by subduction, and the coastal mountains, of course, mountain ranges up and down the west coast, created again by these two plates coming towards each other, resulting in the upheaval of land, and also again, in the case of California and the Pacific Northwest, a lot of volcanic activity that is associated with these subduction zones. So again, you see the North American plate kind of growing towards the west, the Pacific plate kind of growing or moving towards the east, and again creating those upheavals. So your book covers this material as well, and really the whole book kind of talks about the different parts of California and the different types of plants and animals and so forth. So we're going to talk about geomorphic provinces. We could also maybe refer to them as habitats. I think your book uses that phrase sometimes. But basically, as we look across California, we can see areas that are different enough from each other in how they look, the topography, soils, but also therefore in the plant and animal life that live in those areas. And so basically this map shows California's geomorphic provinces. This map is also in the very back of your book, kind of under the flap, at least on mine, in the very back of the book. And so we'll be looking at, again, all of these across the state. So again, as I said, these are sort of naturally defined regions based on geology, and again, therefore all the types of plants and animals that exist there. So we're looking at differences in geology, again, how the landforms were created. We talked about subduction, for example, pushing up the mountain ranges, and then how much weathering and such has occurred over time since those landforms were created. Certainly as we get to some of the coastal areas, we'll be talking about the fault lines. San Andreas fault line, probably the most well-known in the world, and good or bad, we have it here in our backyard in California. Relief, where we have valleys, Central Valley, we have high plateaus or tables, we have very tall, rugged mountains in the Sierra Nevada with lots of exposed jagged rock, younger mountains that haven't weathered as much, more rolling topography in the coastal plains, and again we'll look at those. Climate also plays a huge role in defining these geomorphic provinces. California, again, being probably one of the most diverse states or even places in the world for that matter, where, depending on where you live, you could have a 2-hour drive to a coastal plain, you could be in mountains or in a valley, have a couple-hour drive in another direction, and end up in one of the desert areas. So just a huge amount of diversity that we probably somewhat take for granted living here. So again, we're going to work our way across the state looking at the different provinces. We'll start with the Great Valley, which is basically defined as the area from about Redding all the way through Sacramento, the Delta area, all the way down to around Bakersfield until we start coming up over the Tehachapi Mountains down into the LA basin. So it expands north and south for quite a distance, and is defined basically as an alluvial plain. So it's a large open flat area that basically is sedimented by the fact that it used to be water, an inland sea. And so all of the high areas around it have sedimented down into the valley. All the rivers that feed the valley from the mountain snowmelt create this very large, vast plain that extends about 400 miles north to south, again, around Redding to down around Bakersfield, and about 50 miles wide on average, narrower and obviously wider in other areas. It's actually split up into two separate valleys. The Great Valley is composed of the Sacramento River Valley, which, as you would assume by the name, is primarily fed by the Sacramento River and all the tributaries that feed into it. The Southern Valley, San Joaquin River Valley, again, primarily historically fed by the San Joaquin River, although unfortunately the San Joaquin River isn't even a river in a lot of areas. It's basically a kind of a dry river bed. But again, this is a huge trough that goes north and south where sediments have been deposited for a very long time. Again, we're talking about erosion here, erosion from soils in the mountains all around the valley. Soil is always going to go downhill with water carrying it primarily, again, with all the river systems that feed it. And so all that really good sediment then accumulates, and fortunately for us, it makes for really good agricultural soil as long as you have water, which again, fortunately, we have all the river systems that are fed by snowmelt that flow through the valley. Up more to our north here, Sutter Buttes is kind of one of the prominent features. As you look across the valley, it pretty much is a flat valley, but then you see Sutter Buttes kind of poking up out of nowhere. Kind of one of the smallest sort of self-contained mountain ranges in the world. It's basically just a remnant of a volcano, dormant as far as I know. But again, just kind of a unique landform poking up where there's pretty much nothing but valley around it. And then because of the geology, we also get a lot of oil deposits down in the Bakersfield area. If you've been down there, or if you happen to be going past there, just kind of pay attention as you start getting to that end of the valley, that you'll start seeing those pump jacks basically taking oil. So again, we typically look across the valley. We can see the foothills or the mountains in the distance, at least when it's not too smoggy or the air is better. But just these big flat plains that are now primarily, again, agriculture. We grow all kinds of different crops, more vegetables on the west side of the valley, south and west side of the valley. The east side of the valley has a lot of tree fruits, and I'm talking about the San Joaquin part of the Great Valley. A lot of tree fruit, peaches, plums, nectarines. But of course, grapes that were always, or at least have for a very long time, been grown in the typical place we think of as wine country, Napa Valley, and that sort of part of the state, north of the Bay Area. Grapes are becoming a more and more popular crop all around the state. I remember kind of expanding, seeing the vineyards expand out towards Paso Robles, which is kind of down by San Luis Obispo, inland where it's hotter and drier, and then slowly expanding more into the valley. We've got grapes up here. We see grapes growing up in the mountains now as they continue to develop different varieties. But basically we think of we call the Great Central Valley the breadbasket or the fruit basket of the world because of all the fruit and veggies that we grow. Next we move east from the Great Valley to the Sierra Nevada mountain range, which again, as you can see from the map, extends about the same distance north and south. It's what's referred to as a tilted fault block. Again, 400 miles long roughly. Lots of deep river canyons that are cut into the western slope, so that would be the side facing the valley. Again, it's driven by snowmelt that feeds the rivers all during the spring and summer, and even into the fall, depending on exactly which river system you're talking about. We look at the area called the High Sierra, just the highest granite peaks that extend mostly in the central part of the state, so out kind of east of, say, the Fresno area. Really dramatic granite peaks, exposed rock, because again we've had erosion that has occurred where the topsoil has moved downslope. And the Sierra Nevada is still relatively young, and we know that because when you look at these granite peaks, they're sharp, they're pointed, they're not rounded off. They haven't had as much time to be weathered into more rounded features. A lot of glacier activity as well that has sculpted the Sierra Nevada in the Yosemite Valley, Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is where the Hetch Hetchy Dam is, still in Yosemite National Park. Those areas were carved out by glaciers, going back in the geological history. Colder times, glaciers expand, move forward, scour away the soil, dig down into the rock. Also, Lake Tahoe, influenced by the same thing, scoured out by glaciers. Then as the climate kind of warms up again, those glaciers retreat and melt and then leave behind these scoured out areas of rock. Again, a lot of dramatic features like Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the lower 48 states, stretching nearly 14,500 feet above sea level. Pretty dramatic feature when you are down in the Owens Valley or around Big Pine, those kinds of areas. Once you get up above tree line, which, depending on how far north or south you are, might average around 10,000 feet or so of elevation. Again, you get all of this exposed granite because of the erosion, and just some really, really awesome views if any of you have ever been up higher in the Sierra Nevada. And then we go north of there, so really we're about at the area where Lassen Volcanic National Park is, which is generally considered to be the farthest extent of the Sierra Nevada to the north, and the farthest extent to the south of the Cascade Range. Again, that's Lassen Peak. Lassen National Park is right at that transition zone. And so basically the Cascade Range is defined by chains of volcanoes that stretch again from Lassen through Mount Shasta on up into Oregon and Washington and up the coast of Canada all the way to Alaska. Again, some of them are active, especially up in Washington, and Mount Rainier and some of those kinds of volcanoes are still fairly active. Mount St. Helens that erupted back in the 80s, part of that chain as well. It's remained active. And in our area, there are a lot of river systems that feed through the Cascade Range, but primarily the Pitt River and all the different arms of the Pitt that ultimately feed into Shasta Lake, that ultimately feeds into the Sacramento River, is kind of the dominant river system. Again, we've got slightly more weathered mountains here, not quite as dramatic peaks as we see farther to the south in the Sierra Nevada. See Mount Lassen, of course, and then mud pots like what we see in the bottom left that are found in various places around Mount Lassen. Again, evidence that there's lots of geothermal activity where the earth is boiling up the heat from below, heating water, causing steam, causing movement of gases and things upward, and then creating again all kinds of different interesting geologic features, which again, we're fortunate if you're interested in this kind of stuff that we have it right here in our Lassen National Park. We move to the west a little bit from the Cascade Range, and we get into the Klamath Range, Klamath Mountains that extend again from north and west of Redding and down into the Marble Mountains on north up to Oregon. Again, fairly rugged mountains, younger mountains, not as high peaks as we see in the Sierra or the Cascade Range, on average 6,000 to 9,000 feet. Again, a lot of irregular drainages, rivers that have carved their way down the mountains into the valley or towards the coast. One of the reasons that we find gold in these areas is because of these benches that are left behind from the uplifting. So we find quartz, and then we find areas that can bear gold that have to be extracted from the rocks. Kind of consider this area kind of again a breakaway or separate area of island habitat. Not literally an island in the ocean, but an island of habitat surrounded by other different types of habitat. So again, similar to the Sierra Nevada in a lot of ways, younger, rugged mountain range, but again, not quite as high as the Sierra or Cascade Range. Again, in California, we have some wilderness areas out there, like I said, Marble Mountains, for example. Lots of great opportunities for hiking and camping and fishing and hunting or whatever outdoor activities you might like to do. Then we move up to the northeastern corner of California, where we have the Modoc Plateau. It's a volcanic tableland. Plateau means table. We think of areas that are high, typically elevation-wise, much higher than the valley, thousands of feet of elevation, but high, flat, almost deserty types of areas. Again, because this area is just adjacent to the Cascade Range, which, as we mentioned, has a lot of volcanic influence, these areas also have volcanic influence. Basically, lava flows from the past have created these large flat expanses. As the lava would be expelled during an eruption, it would just kind of spread across the landscape and cool down and basically create this flat tableland. A lot of small volcanic cones. Again, most of them are dormant or inactive at this point. You go up towards Tule Lake, the Lava Beds National Monument. You can see a lot of influence up that way of what we're talking about here. You do find lakes occasionally. Again, because it's kind of an open, flat area, it has allowed for marshes and wetlands to accumulate, which is one of those areas would be the Tule National Wildlife Refuge up there. So it provides great wildlife habitat, especially for migratory animals, ducks and geese that fly through. This provides important resting areas for them as they migrate to and from their winter and summer grounds. Because it's relatively flat land, the streams that we do see in that area are relatively slow moving. They don't tend to carve as deep a path as the rivers coming out of the high elevation mountains. And again, if we look at the map, it's basically bound or surrounded by the Cascade Range to the west of it, and the Basin Range to the east of the Modoc Plateau. So again, we're talking about higher elevation, relatively flat land, remnants of volcanoes. We have Glass Mountain up that way, where we find a lot of obsidian, and again some lakes up there as well that have been stocked with fish. And then basically these areas that just do look kind of deserty: brushland, sagebrush, scrub oaks, those kinds of trees. We see forested areas as well that'll have pines, primarily Jeffrey pine. But just because we're talking about generally shallower soil, not as fertile soil, those trees don't grow as fast or don't tend to get as large. So we tend to see more of this this sort of, again, sagebrush dominated landscape, coyote brush, again pinyon pine, that kind of stuff. Then we jump to the opposite end of the state. We have an interesting geologic feature in California that most mountain ranges, and this would be true generally if you think of the United States, the main mountain ranges run north and south. But in California, we actually have a transverse range that runs from the coast inland towards the Mojave and Colorado deserts. So again, kind of a different feature. We don't typically see these east-west mountain ranges. Again, perpendicular to the coast ranges, so again pointing inland, east and west rather than north and south. And as you continue off into the ocean, San Miguel, Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz Islands are all part of this transverse range. There's a lot of compression going on here from things like subduction. And so again, the mountains are being pushed up still. Probably one of the areas on the planet that's moving the most. And again, it could be millimeters or centimeters a year, which from a geologic perspective is still a lot of movement. Again, we have oil deposits here as well because of the geology. Southern Great Valley and this area are right adjacent to each other. So again, also significant oil deposits. Again, we have steep rocky coastline from the transverse range that extends out into the ocean, and again some of the islands out there on into the desert. Then probably the largest area in California that kind of almost gets broken into two parts, the north and south coast ranges. It's really just one province, but because of the proximity or the placement of the Bay Area, and that kind of almost being the divide between Northern California and Southern California, we often refer to these as the South Coast Range or the North Coast Range. So much lower peaks, a few peaks maybe creeping up near that 6,000 foot elevation, but definitely lower, more rolling areas parallel to the San Andreas Fault. So one of the more active geologic areas on the planet. If you go to the California Earthquake website, you can just Google that. I kind of just look at it every day out of interest. You see lots and lots of earthquake activity up and down the coastal area of California, and then it dramatically tapers off once you get farther to the north of Oregon, Washington. You'll still have a lot of activity up in Alaska and the whole ring of fire that we'll get into, but California, at least partially because of the San Andreas Fault and how many fault lines we have, is just daily hundreds of earthquakes across the state. So again, interesting from the standpoint of that, at least from a geologic standpoint. Of course, earthquakes have a ability to cause a lot of damage and loss of lives, so that's obviously something we're concerned about. Once we started having the technology, of course, we require buildings in earthquake areas to be built in such a way that they can withstand some level of a fairly strong earthquake. So we don't have the kind of Northridge situation that we did in the past. As I said, the north and south coast ranges are typically defined by slightly different conditions. The North Range has a lot of irregular topography created by landslides. Again, some areas of volcanic overlays. North of the Bay Area, around Clear Lake and Sonoma County, there's a geologic hot springs feature down there, geysers. I forget exactly what the designation is, but geysers. And so they tap into geothermal power there, and it provides energy for some of the citizens in that area. As you get farther to the north, you get of the Bay Area, you get less of this volcanic activity. Again, more rolling, gently rolling topography, especially in the springtime. You get all of these grasses and wildflowers. Blue oaks and interior live oaks typically dominate the landscape, along with gray pines, manzanita. But again, kind of a real pretty habitat in the spring. As we get into the summer, starts drying out, becomes maybe a little less visually pleasing, but a very pretty landscape. Of course, we got the huge Bay Area, and the topography there similar, except of course now it's dominated by people. We've filled in a lot of areas around the bay to have land to build on. And as you go south, you get more open plains along the coast, less high, rocky coastline that you get to the north, but mostly the similar type of habitat, rolling hills, oaks, pines, and a lot of brush species. Then we head to the very southwestern corner of California, where we have peninsular ranges, similar to our north and south coast range. Mountains going kind of northwest in direction, along with some valleys parallel to the peninsular ranges. Also, again, areas where the San Andreas Fault continues on. Somewhat similar geology to the Sierras as well, again created by that uplifting and so forth. To the very north, it extends kind of right at that Santa Catalina Island, where the extent of the transverse range actually creeps in the southern part of the coastal range, on down into the Baja area. Next, we look at the Basin Range. Just noticed a typo. It says Basin and Range. I guess the Basin Range. We've got it kind of it continues mostly on into Nevada, which is why it looks odd that we've got one area to the south, a little point right there just south of Lake Tahoe, and then a couple other little bands of this basin going into the northern part of California. Remember, the Great Basin continues on into Nevada and Utah, so California is just getting the very western tip of again, a much larger geomorphic province. So again, it's a range that's surrounded by fault lines and these large basins that have kind of almost collapsed or dropped down below the mountains around them, called grabens. A lot of times, because it is a huge basin, you get the rivers fed by snowmelt drain down into the basin and accumulate in areas, Great Salt Lake, for example, and then ultimately they don't necessarily have any outlets. In other words, they don't make it to the ocean. So you get a lot of open areas, lakes, and playas. Just went to a lake kind of north of Reno that I didn't even know was there. Pyramid Lake. Just trying to remember what it was called. That's actually again a playa fed by snowmelt. It's in its own kind of huge basin. It collects water from the surrounding foothills and mountains, and just stays there. Again, it doesn't have an outlet to the ocean. Down in Southern California, Death Valley, probably the best known of these areas of basin that have the basins and the mountain ranges. Owens Valley, a little bit to the north of that, again south of Lake Bishop. Honey Lake Basin, farther up to the north here on the way over to Reno. So again, here's a typical look down at these basins. Again, you can tell very dry landscape. Even the mountains and foothills, scattered sagebrush, lots of bare ground and bare rock. Then you'll see these basins. Some may have some water accumulation, at least part of the year. See in this case all the salt deposits. You get the water going down, taking minerals with it, and then because of how hot and dry it is, the water evaporates, leaves behind those minerals. So you get the Great Salt Lake. You get the basins that accumulate in California, Nevada, Utah again. To the south of that, we have the Mojave Desert. Again, a very broad, flat region that's totally interior. Isolated mountains that are separated by these vast, expansive deserts. Lots of enclosed drainages and playas. Again, you're going to get some rainfall, even if it's just up in the little bit higher elevation. And of course, water is always going to go downhill. So there are areas where you get either drainages that only maybe run when there's actually rain occurring, or playas, big open, shallow kind of lakes. Again, a lot of fault lines through this area. Again, very much a deserty landscape, a lot of weathered rock, more rounded rock that's been weathered by wind and well, probably mostly wind, water. A lot of plants now that are especially adapted for this kind of climate. A lot of different types of cactus like cholla. You get the different types of yucca or Joshua trees farther to the south. It's a very rough landscape, very rough living for plants and animals. But obviously there are some that are adapted to that type of condition. And then the Colorado Desert to the very south of the state, which again, more of this extends down into Mexico. A very low desert basin. A lot of it around the Salton Sea and so forth is actually below sea level, kind of like Death Valley. Geologically, we talk about it being a depressed block between active branches of the San Andreas Fault, so it's constantly being shaped by volcanism. As you continue south and east into Mexico, it connects basically with the Sonoran Desert, the desert in and around Tucson, Arizona, and certainly south down into Mexico. Again, a lot of the landscape is pretty rugged. The mountains or foothills are largely rocky, very little plant life. Again, you get things like Joshua trees, sagebrush, coyote brush, manzanita, some of that kind of stuff. But again, very deserty landscape. So there's a link you can click on there to review, and there's a link in Canvas where you can review the geologic, or I should say geomorphic provinces. Your assignment this week is kind of partly a journal assignment and just kind of a summary assignment where you're going to be looking at the geomorphic provinces that are in Northern California. And as you have a chance to get out and about a little bit, make sure you're jotting notes down in your field guide about when you notice that you've gone from maybe the valley to the Cascade or Sierra or Klamath or Coastal Range, wherever you might have a chance to be. Also, there's a link in this lecture that kind of does like a flyover for you, so you can kind of do an aerial view and see how these landscapes look. The actual habitat looks, rather than just this sort of map with a bunch of different colors on it. And then next week we'll be getting into weather and climate, and talking about the differences and how these features or factors really shape our environment, the plants, and again, therefore the animals.